Got Joe Hunk on the line, the Fallout 740 there in Montgomery, Alabama, talking up some Auburn football. We got spring practice starting in a few weeks. Of course, the 2019 recruiting class just wrapped up on National Signing Day, the second version, that first Wednesday of February, just a couple of weeks ago, in Auburn with a nice class, unless you compare them to Alabama, but a great national class. And that was one of our storylines with Joe the first time we had him on, was talking about, man, Auburn's bringing in more talent. They're looking good, unless you got to compare them against the in-state rival that's tougher than anybody else in the country. You got 6 hard commits for 2020. The class is ranked highly, although that doesn't mean a whole lot at this point in the game with like 11 months left until the first National Signing Day. So your thoughts about Gus Malzahn not necessarily being one of the more popular coaches in the SEC, but still hauling in some top talent?
Well, the thing is how do we grade a recruit class now in 2019? For the on the surface fan, you see what you just mentioned, a great recruiting class. You've got the top 10, top 12 team in the country. This class looked really good. There are universities and there are teams that would die to have a top 11 recruiting class. But the problem is Auburn is getting players that are good, but at the same position that they already have players. Whereas in other places that are weaknesses, they're not really focused on. If you go back and you see our conversation that we had before National Signing Day, we said that the thing that they need to focus on is the offensive line. Now, they got 3 offensive line players. The main problem is they all play one position, and that wasn't the priority. You mentioned Alabama. Go look at Alabama's recruiting classes. Go look at Ohio State's. Go look at Georgia's. I mentioned this because these are the schools that year in and year out continue to have the best recruiting classes and football teams in the country. They make an offensive lineman the priority. Auburn got 3 offensive guards. That's all they got. They didn't get offensive tackles. Now, you mentioned the 2020 class. They have an offensive tackle in that class. He is a 4-star. But that's next season. That's not going to be helping the Auburn team going into 2019. Yes, they got a great linebacker. They got a player that's considered an athlete, and he actually was, at the time, they were talking about him potentially being a safety, but instead they're going to be swapping him over to the position because Gus Malzahn says what he does really see in this guy, and I'm talking about Mark Anthony Richards, is he could be the next Kerryon Johnson, which is now the starting running back for the Detroit Lions. So they do have good players, and they did have a really good class, but I still don't feel like they hit the priorities that they're really needing to, and that is the offensive line. So numbers-wise, it's great. It's number 11 class, but you didn't hit that spot that was your biggest weakness in 2018, which could still be a big weakness going into 2019.
And it's like if you don't load up on defensive backs in the Big 12 when everybody's spreading you 5 wide and they've got a capable quarterback, they're going to tear you to shreds. And that's what we see in the Big 12 just about every week because nobody's got that many cornerbacks. You're going to have the same problem in the SEC where you've got the best defensive ends and outside linebackers in the country and defensive tackles rushing the quarterback and collapsing the pocket. And if you don't have an offensive line and can't establish the running game, then you're hurting big.
Well, and for me, I don't want, and this can happen, and this happens in all sports. There have been times where a player that's 6'8" has been playing the point guard position for his high school because he's the only one that they have that can bring the basketball up, and eventually they transition him into a shooting guard or power forward or small forward, and that happens. In baseball, sometimes you have a guy that was playing in the outfield, but he's only 5'6". He's a great hitter, has great speed, so you move him over to second base. In football, that's going to happen. You're going to be able to take an offensive guard and transition them into an offensive tackle position. Look at Prince Tega. Prince Tega came to Auburn, and he had barely even played football altogether. And last year, he was graded out as the number 1 offensive tackle in the country. So that can happen, but you still have tons of offensive tackles that you would like to have those guys come in and be the centerpiece of a great offensive line where they already know how to play offensive tackle, and you just got to figure out they're playing left or right, not having to learn how to move from offensive guard or center to that tackle position. And there's a learning curve. In the SEC, you don't have that time anymore. I mean, a lot of these coaches are on 2 and 3 year windows, and if they're not successful in those 3 or 4 years, they're out. And so now you've got to make sure that you get these players in, and they've got to be good to go and to go into that depth chart. Auburn didn't have depth last year. I don't know if 3 offensive guards are going to help that depth going into 2019.